Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor. I'm a Sony Global Imaging Ambassador. Let me walk you through the camera settings I use when I'm shooting landscapes handheld. There is another movie in the playlist that looks at landscape settings, and that one uses tripods. The camera settings are quite different, so you may want to set the camera up either way depending on whether you want to use a tripod or not. Now, because depth of field is a priority when shooting landscapes, I'm going to be setting the shoot mode dial to A, or aperture priority, and then using the front dial you're going to set the aperture to f11. This is going to increase the depth of field in the scene. Now we're going to dive into the menu. Press the menu button on the very first page of the first camera tab. I'm going to set the quality setting, the file format, to RAW. Now this does give us a little bit more latitude when post-processing. Okay, so I'm also going to set the RAW file type to uncompressed. Now I may use compress for action sports, may even use it for portraiture, but for landscape, if you are going to use that uncompressed file format, this is definitely the genre to do that. We are going to be recovering shadows quite a lot in some instances, and so this does give us a little bit more protection when post-processing. Color space, we're on the second page here. Now just keep an eye on where I'm moving through the pages. You'll see that little orange square on the bottom of the screen just start moving over to the right, and also on the top right of the camera monitor you're going to see the page number there. So just keep an eye to see where we are, and you may want to follow along as we set up the camera. Color space is not actually that important for RAW shooters. It's more important for JPEG shooters, and if you were a JPEG shooter I would lean you towards shooting Adobe RGB for landscapes. You're going to get more detail in the rich saturated colors that way. Word of warning, however, if you're preparing images for the web you will need to convert those images to the sRGB file format. Lens compensations. Now in my camera I've got these all set to auto. You do have to be a little bit wary. There are some instances where Lightroom, for instance, doesn't know that the lens corrections have already been applied in camera and will attempt to apply them again. And with something like lens shading or distortion you can get those corrections applied twice. You can see when that happens because instead of the colors being corrected in the corners of the image actually look a little bit lighter than normal, and so just make sure that they're corrected once and not twice. Drive mode, single shooting. We're not going to be taking bursts of shots as we take a single landscape. Typically we're going to take one image, review it, maybe change our position slightly, and then take one more image. There is an alternative, and that is self timer 2 seconds. This is an alternative drive mode. When the ambient light gets a little bit low and maybe the shutter speed starts slowing down, it's a way of making sure that we can reduce the risk of camera shake by pressing the shutter release, waiting 2 seconds, steadying our breath, and then the camera takes the shot. Now I will set the memory setting up on the camera for single shooting. We can always override that to a 2-second self timer later. While we're looking at that, just below the drive mode you can see the bracket setting. If we are going to want to set that 2-second delay, we can also apply that to the bracket settings as well. Typically I don't bracket a lot of the landscapes. These full frame sensors Sony are making have such a broad dynamic range. So long as we're careful with our exposure, there is often very little need to actually bracket that exposure. Now we are going to be looking at a lot of settings in this movie tutorial. We'll probably be cracking on for an hour or so. So you don't have to remember all of the settings because the camera can remember them for you. So long as we go through that whole process, we can then register them. We're going to register them in this menu item, but we'll be coming back to this menu item. Once we have memorized those settings, it's just a simple method of just rolling that shoot mode dial down to our save memory setting and recalling all of those settings. These settings will be a starting point only. We are or do have the option of changing our mind about aperture or drive mode from single shooting to 2-second delay, and that is a possibility. As soon as we turn away from that memorized setting and then back again, we'll start back at the default settings. So this is a great way of quickly entering in the most appropriate settings, but not using them as a straitjacket for our creativity. Okay, so we're on the 5th page, and the focus mode I am setting to DMF, direct manual focus. This is where the camera can use autofocus, but we do have the opportunity of, when the camera has focused, turning the focus ring on the lens and just fine-tuning that focus. This will only work if we've got the shutter release half pressed, or if you're using a back button autofocus workflow, keeping your AF on button on so it's locked on, and then overriding that with the focus ring on the lens. We'll look at that in more detail a little bit later. Focus area, expand flexible spot. This is where we can use the multi-selector or joystick to position the focus point in the image. Typically we are bringing the focus point nearer towards us rather than focusing on the horizon. This will give us maximum depth of field in our landscape photography. The memory setting will remember the starting point for your focus point. Now you can just leave that in the middle. Just by pressing the multi-selector in will put it back into the middle of the viewfinder. Typically I start with the focus point a little bit lower in the frame. And the reason for that is typically I'm bringing the focus point to something closer in the scene, and that most likely will be in the lower third of that frame. We can always fine-tune that later. It's just another way of fast-tracking that starting point for our memorized settings. There's a great depth of field calculator at Cambridge in Colour. Now that is the English spelling of the word colour rather than the American spelling, so watch out for that U there. Now this depth of field calculator lets you see how much depth of field you have when we're using a particular lens at an aperture. Now I'm giving you an example of a 16-35 zoom lens at the 16mm focal length. Also stop down to f11, and you can see how extensive the depth of field is. Now the little red box in the bottom right hand corner of the screen shows you the hyperfocal distance. That's the optimum place to focus in the scene to give us maximum depth of field from the nearest subject matter right out to the distant mountains or horizon line there. And you can see the hyperfocal distance is just over 7 feet away from the camera, and that will bring a depth of field from just over 3.5 feet in front of the camera all the way out to infinity or the horizon line. The depth of field won't be quite as extensive if we're using, say, a 24-70 zoom, and we're at the 24mm focal length. We'd probably need to double the distance for the hyperfocal distance. If in doubt, just head over to Cambridge in Colour. The important thing to remember, however, is you don't have to worry too much about where you position your focus point, because I'm hopefully reassuring you that the depth of field is quite extensive when using a wide angle focal length and an aperture of f11. Okay, so if we take a look at the bottom of that AF1 page there, you'll see that quite complex menu item, which is switch vertical horizontal AF area. Now if you do go into these options and basically choose, say, this one, it does give you an opportunity to save a memory, so we can lower the focus point in the frame for when the camera is in horizontal orientation and have a separate focus point for when we're holding the camera in vertical orientation. So it does give you a starting point lower in the frame, depending on whether we're using vertical or horizontal orientations of the camera. So you might want to go and set that up for vertical orientation as well. Now typically if I'm shooting landscapes and the camera's on a tripod hands-free, I will put that camera at ISO 100, but because the camera is handheld and we might be shooting in low ambient light, I'm going to set that to ISO auto. If the level of ambient light is very bright, it's still going to choose the lowest ISO it can, so we are safeguarded for the maximum quality so long as the ambient light is quite high. Now I'm going to be looking at the auto or the ISO auto minimum shutter speed. Now that will typically be set to standard, but we can go into this setting and lower that. Now I've lowered that to 1/8 of a second when I'm shooting with my wide angle lenses such as the 16-35. Now you may not be able to hand hold 1/8 of a second, but I think you will be able to go lower than the camera thinks you can go. The camera will often stop at, say, something like a 60th of a second. Now I think most people can go much slower than that, and if you do go slower than that 1/60th of a second, you are going to keep the ISO low even in low ambient light. Let's show you some examples of that. Okay, so first off, I do need to point out that you can practice holding the camera very steady to get those 1/8 of a second or maybe even slower and get pin sharp images. So there's 4 areas that you really need to start practicing stance. If you're standing with the camera, don't stand with your feet together. Adopt a sort of a stance that maybe an archer or somebody with a gun would adopt, which is legs apart. Keep your elbows tucked in. If you can put your elbows on a surface such as the ground or a nearby wall or tree, that will also help you keep the camera very steady. Breathing, make sure you've got your breath calm or steady when you make the exposure. And also the release. Don't stab the shutter release, press it exceptionally gently. And if you're having trouble pressing the shutter release gently, then maybe use that 2-second timer delay, that self timer, so that you can get a very steady camera when the shutter is actually released. And then if with a little bit of practice, you should be able to do what I can do, which is to hand hold the camera in with very slow shutter speeds. So remember, if you do have a little bit of trouble with that last one, just use that self timer 2-second delay. This was captured at 1/8 of a second on the A7R Mark III at 16mm of the 16-35 GM, and it is pin sharp. Okay, so sometimes I will take 2 or 3 just to make sure I get a sharp one, because occasionally you may have got a little bit of movement in your hand and lose one shot. To give you some other examples, this is 1/5 of a second, and I'm stopping down. ISO is 100, and I'm getting depth of field going all of the way through the image from that near foreground subject matter right out to that horizon line. The steady shot is our friend here. The 5-axis stabilization on the sensors is exceptionally good. Now typically we turn that off when we're using the cameras on tripods, but we're going to be looking at that setting a little bit later. The steady shot is going to be on for this handheld photography. Here's another example, 25mm focal length, 1/5 of a second, handheld. 1/13 of a second. The shell is a little bit soft on the right, only because the water that's rushing in is moving the shell slightly, but that 1/13 of a second also helps to give us that beautiful movement in the water when hand holding this. And this is absolutely the first light of day. I don't think well, I think the sun has just hit the horizon now. Okay, so 1/4 of a second. Okay, you may not be able to hand hold these without a little bit of practice, but I think with just a little bit of practice you should be able to slow down certainly below 1/30 of a second. here I am again. This is almost the middle of the night now. The sun has set quite a long time ago. We're using 1/8 of a second, and I am opening the aperture a little bit from that f11, and the ISO is going higher than that 100. But the cameras are exceptionally good with raised ISOs, so you don't have to be too worried about the ISO going higher than 100. I actually got into the Sony Alpha systems by hand holding an image for a long time. With the launch of the Alpha 100, I was taken into a rainforest, and I was told that the best shot would win the camera, and here I am hand holding 1 second on this image. I am on the ground, both elbows are on the ground. I'm stopped down to f16 or more to get maximum depth of field, and I managed to pull off a 1 second exposure that was pin sharp. Okay, so that really sort of launched my association with Sony. Occasionally you're going to be using lenses that maybe not the wide angle lenses, so if you don't want to write that into your memory setting, just take the ISO auto minimum shutter speed, which will start by its default at standard, and just move that through slow to slower. This will allow the shutter speed to go slower than, say, 60th of a second with a 50mm lens would now be firing off at a 15th of a second, and most people, I think, with good steady shot on can hand hold 1/15th of a second. One of the reasons you might like to use slower as your default starting point rather than 1/8 of a second, say, is when we're using longer telephoto lenses to shoot our landscapes. So if this was captured at focal length of about 100mm, the camera would be using a shutter speed around about a 50th of a second with that slower set. And again, you will still need to brace the camera, tuck in the elbows, put your elbows on a nearby surface if you can, but most people can hand hold this. And this will always ensure the ISO is kept as low as possible when we're taking our landscape images. And also, there's occasions when we're going to be using extreme telephotos. These are a couple of handheld landscapes that I captured with a 400mm lens with a 1.4 teleconverter, which is an effective focal length of 560mm. Okay, and again, I would be using the slower shutter speed, the ISO auto minimum shutter speed, in order to give myself a nice steady camera. Even when I go out intending to do landscape photography handheld, I might just pack a very small tabletop tripod or a small portable tripod in my messenger bag. Now, I don't tend to like big tripods for landscape, and one of the reasons for that is most of my landscape photography is actually shot very close to the ground. I feel it gives you a much better sense of drama. It brings the foreground into the image. It gives you a sense of place, and as you can see from a lot of my landscape photography, that is my favored vantage point. Now I've got this picture of an iceberg that I shot in Alaska. The camera is actually mounted on a little Manfrotto Pixie, which is a tabletop tripod. Not that I ever put these tripods on tables. The lovely thing about these little tripods is they will fit in your pocket even, and I always keep one in a messenger bag. Just take a look at this dramatic picture of this iceberg in Alaska on a beach, and then take a look at a picture of me actually taking this picture, a lot less dramatic. Just a word of warning, just make sure you don't actually dunk the camera in the water. I get very, very close to water, but I'm always wary of water lapping up onto the camera. Okay, you really want to avoid that. Okay, and there's the picture of the image again, captured. Okay, so just to give you another example of that beautiful low vantage point, some people might think that this is actually a lake. This is in a mountainous region called the Grampians in Victoria, but if I show you the angle of view, it's actually just a puddle. I do love that glorious low vantage point for giving very dramatic images. We go back to the handheld settings now. Metering mode, just use multi. We're going to monitor the optimum exposure using our histogram and reviewing the image or a test image after we've taken it. And then we're going to use the exposure compensation dial to either increase or decrease the exposure. White balance, I will typically just leave this to auto. I know some people prefer setting the white balance in camera, but I tend to shoot very early in the morning and very late in the day, and the white balance tends to be moving, or the color temperature tends to be moving very rapidly around this period of time. So you'd be constantly chasing the moving or shifting colors with setting white balance in camera. We can always set the white balance in RAW in the post-production, and there is no problem with damaging the file that way. The white balance is just a reference that can be then used or discarded in the RAW processing. We're coming on to the 12th page of that first camera tab. It's the color white balance image processing page here. We have this DRO, which is dynamic range optimizer here. Now I will actually use this setting. Typically by default it's set to auto. If you're wanting to lighten the shadows on the monitor and in the EVF even a little bit more, you can set that to a particular setting like LV2 or even higher. Another way of lowering the contrast on the monitor and in the EVF, because I'm often shooting in landscapes with extreme contrast, is I'll go into the creative style menu, which is just below the DRO menu. Move over to the right in, say, the neutral setting, and just lower the contrast to say -2 or -3. This will again have a big impact on the monitor and EVF. Here's the word of warning, however. DRO and creative style is not applied to RAW, and this leads many people to thinking that their images are underexposed when they open them in the RAW processor. To give you an example, this is what might happen if you've lowered the contrast in the creative style and also using quite an aggressive dynamic range optimizer setting. This would be applied to a JPEG, but it's not applied to the RAW file. So when you open the same RAW file in, say, Lightroom or Capture One, the shadows are going to look significantly darker. This isn't you underexposing the file. Now, typically the optimum exposure for this image is you base on the highlights and not on the shadows. Okay, and the way we're going to do that is when we take one test image and then hit the review button, we're going to hit the display button a couple of times until we can see the histogram. Now, any overexposed highlights will blink at us. If they are blinking, we can just use the exposure compensation dial to move the exposure slightly down. If they're not blinking, if there's a little bit of a gap between the histogram and the right side, you possibly want to increase the exposure using a plus exposure compensation dial. The higher you can raise the exposure, the better for the quality of the shadows. So just to recap on there, when basing my exposure in this particular image, I'm going as high as I can before those brightest highlights behind those rocks in the sea start blinking at me. And then in post-production, I will grab the shadow slider and raise it to +80 or even more, and I'll bring the highlight slider down. I'll add some contrast, vibrance, maybe a graduated filter, and within a minute there is my image. The sensors on these Sony cameras are very good at recovering beautiful rich detail in those shadows. So never get a shock when you first open your RAW images seeing how dark the shadows are. That is just the starting point for RAW processing. We're coming up onto the 13th page now, and we're coming up into Focus Assist. This is where we're going to set up the settings. So for DMF, which is if we press or half press the shutter release, snap on focus, and then we want to fine tune the focus, I'll put the MF Assist on because I'm going to be using MF Assist in conjunction with Focus Magnifier. Peaking, I typically don't use peaking. If you're using shallow depth of field, peaking might be critical to your success at getting the focus right. But because we're using f11 and the depth of field will be broad, peaking is less critical. For instance, if we're magnifying view, the initial magnification area will appear maybe in the center of the screen, but we can move that down with the joystick if we're trying to assess whether the focus in the foreground is sharp. We will then depress the button that we've set up for focus magnify, and then we can zoom in and check sharp focus. So we're on the second camera tab, page 4. Silent shooting is not something that we typically use for landscape, so you want to be switching that off. E-front curtain shutter is on. This will help reduce any risk of shutter shock from having a complete mechanical shutter. We're also going to be putting steady shot on. Now, some lenses that have a steady shot button on the lens itself means that when you come to this setting, it may appear grayed out. So if that's the case, just remember to make that adjustment on the lens and not in the camera menus. Now we're coming over to the 6th page of that second camera tab, display button. There are a couple of display features for the monitor and EVF that will make our job capturing great landscape photographs just that little bit easier. So just go into that display button and choose the monitor option. Just make sure you've got histogram checked there, and also level, which is the little spirit level in the camera. Just to make sure, if you didn't already have those on and you've just checked those, also make sure you come over to the right there and hit the center button in the control wheel on the back of the camera to enter that. This means that when we cycle the display button, when we're looking at our landscape in the camera, we can get different levels of information shown to us. So we can make sure the camera is absolutely level. We can look at the histogram before we take the picture, just to make sure that we're in the ballpark figure for the exposure. If we're not, just use the exposure compensation dial to either raise or lower the exposure. Okay, on the page 6, we've got the grid line option. Now this is an option that some people like to have available in the EVF and on the monitor. It's typically something that I don't use. I can sort of naturally frame an image myself. I can imagine the rule of thirds. I don't really need to be shown it. But if you need to be shown a grid overlay so you can accurately place your horizon line on that rule of thirds, then by all means choose that as an option. Now I actually think that it's a little bit of a straitjacket personally, because I don't use rule of thirds for all of the framing of my landscapes. This might on the quick glance may look like it's the rule of thirds, but it's actually the golden ratio. We can actually get these overlays when cropping an image in a program like Lightroom. It tends to be a little bit less aggressive than rule of thirds, and I think a lot more of my landscapes lean towards the golden ratio than actually the rule of thirds. So that's one of the reasons that I don't use that grid overlay. And of course, there's many instances where we want to create a landscape that's perfectly symmetrical, and we put the vanishing point right in the middle of the frame. And again, that rule of thirds or golden ratio isn't going to be any help to us in those instances at all. Use the rule of thirds if you like, but it's not something that I've chosen to do. Live view display, setting effect on. Now this is something that I do encourage you to do. If the level of ambient light is reasonably bright, then this is going to get you seeing a depth of field preview. We're going to be shooting at a smaller aperture like f11, and so you're going to be able to assess whether your scene is completely sharp, because we'll be reviewing the scene through the actual aperture we're taking the picture. This is something that DSLR users don't actually see. They may have selected f11, but they're viewing the scene through the widest aperture. That's why they have a depth of field preview button on the high-end DSLRs. Auto review. This is something that I typically have switched off. I can always press the little review button on the back of the camera if I want to review an image. It's certainly something that I don't switch on for something like action sports or portraiture, but if we're just taking one picture every 4 or 5 minutes, you may actually want to have that review switched on. It just might save you a couple of seconds by pressing the review button on the back of the camera. One of the other things that you might want to do, and this is separated from all of the AF tabs, is we've come to that little suitcase menu, the toolbox there, which is the camera setup menus, and we're on the second page there. It's touch operation, which is a focus feature. If we don't want to use the multi-selector or joystick to move that focus point, we could, for instance, just touch the back of the camera to move the focus point to a rock in the foreground that's just like 7 or 8 feet away, or 2 or 3 meters, in order to get the maximum depth of field, that hyperfocal distance that we looked at earlier. Okay, so you've got a couple of options on the touch operation there. I typically have mine set to touch panel only. Okay, and this is where we come all of the way back to that first camera tab, third page, and this is where we're going to assign all of those settings to a memory. So just come down to memory, press the center button in the control wheel to enter that, and then choose a location. Now I've got this little acronym that I've been using for a while now called PAL. I set my portrait settings for number 1, my action settings for number 2, and my landscape settings for number 3. And now the shoot mode dial is definitely my pal when it comes to those memory recall settings. Now, one of the things that you may also want to do is save these settings to a memory card, so you've got a backup that you can actually store on your laptop. I've got a separate movie on which I've called Total Recall, so you can always recover your camera's memory settings from a memory card if you want to later. Once you press the center button, that will be registered to that position on the shoot mode dial. You can always just go back into the memory and then use those M1, M2, M3. There's even an M4 setting there. Just remember those are saved to the memory card. If you reformat that memory card, those settings will be gone. I typically use a memory card in slot 2, the upper of the slots, even though I'm recording the actual images that I'm capturing to slot 1. And I'm always wary about reformatting that if I don't have those memory settings backed up to my computer. If you do save it to the M1 to M4 settings, you will get a confirmation about which slot it's been saved to, so you don't eject the wrong card and try and back up the wrong, or looking for something that's actually not on that card. Now I just want to come over to one feature that I don't typically write into the memory, but as the light gets exceptionally low, the ambient light is, we're going from, it's not sunrise or sunset, it's like maybe 20 minutes, half an hour after sunset, or half an hour before sunrise. If we're shooting with closed down apertures and with low levels of ambient light, the viewfinder will appear exceptionally noisy. There is not a lot of light getting to the sensor. You may also struggle to find focus when there's so little light reaching the sensor at those closed down apertures. So this is a setting that I would encourage you to do in those instances. Now I haven't written it into the memory setting, but it's something that I would like to cover before I finish this tutorial. It's called live view display. It's one of the great advantages of working with a mirrorless camera is we get the what you see is what you get view. So we're alerted to the fact that we may be underexposing or overexposing an image, and then we can use the exposure compensation dial to compensate for that exposure error even before we take the image. But there are some instances where that what you see is what you get view is not working for us, and that is when it gets very dark. And so you really want to come into this setting effect. Now it's on that second camera tab on page 7 on my camera, and we need to switch that setting effect from on to off. Now we're not going to get warning about underexposure or overexposure. We'll need to review the image to see whether that's the case. But suddenly a lot more light will start reaching the sensor. We might be using f8, but the camera will now use the maximum aperture, if available, to give more light to that sensor. So the whole EVF monitor will appear less noisy. The camera will focus more easily. This is such a useful feature that I've actually put this option into my function menu. I don't want to be diving into the menus trying to remember what page it's on, so I put that in my function menu. And if you want to do the same, if you also think this is a great option to put in your FN menu, just go over to custom operation, that's page 8 on the second camera tab, and come into the function menu settings, and then choose a position either on the upper row or the lower row. There's quite a few of those options that are doubling up. For instance, you'll always see an ISO option, which we don't really need because we have ISO on the control wheel on the back of the camera. So you can always find one to replace with a more useful function such as live view display. Okay, so hopefully you found that useful. If you have, please remember to subscribe to this channel, share, and also head over to my website www.markgaylor.com. All of the learning resources, and there's lots of them, is all free. If you have downloaded maybe some e-books or some actions, or you're just finding this content exceptionally useful, just consider making a small donation, which will help me with my hosting fees and help me create new content to support the Alpha community. Okay, cheers. I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Global Imaging Ambassador.